I'll be explaining in this video what the notary does, who chooses him or her, which documents are needed before, during the appointment, which costs are associated and who needs to bear them, and what happens at the notary appointment itself. Hi, my name is Ajay, and in this channel, we'll be guiding you on how to buy a house here in Germany. A notary is responsible for notarizing the contract of a sale of a property in the presence of the buyer and the seller. This process is mandatory in Germany, because only with the conclusion of a notarized contract, the sale of a house becomes legally binding. The notary checks in advance that all conditions for the sale are met and that there are no more land charges in the land register. The notary oversees the entire transaction from a legal point of view. In addition, he or she subsequently takes care of other relevant steps such as change of ownership in the land register and the registration of the buyer's new land charge. Once the seller and the buyer of the house have agreed on the purchase, both parties agree jointly on a notary appointment. In Germany, it is usual for the buyer to select the notary. However, the seller can also make suggestions. Once the notary has been agreed upon, the seller and the buyer must provide the notary with all necessary documents for drawing up the draft purchase agreement in a timely manner. The most important thing you need to bring to the notary appointment is your passport, or for German citizens, the ID card, the Personalausweis, a valid identification document. Please also remember that your tax identification number is needed, as this is also required. Please note, your tax ID is not identical with your tax number, but most notaries ask this info upfront already. If you've taken a home loan for the purchase of the property, the loan will only be paid out to you if the new land charge has been notarized by the notary upfront. To do this, the notary needs the land charge form from your financing bank, which should ideally be available 1 or 2 days before the appointment. If it needs to be translated upfront, please bear in mind that this also takes a day or two. However, if you, as the buyer, do not receive the land charge form until after the notary appointment, it can be notarized later as well. As soon as the bank has received the form, the financing amount is paid out to the buyer. Respectively, it's the prerequisite for the payout. If the notary appointment is cancelled by one of the contracting parties, but the notary has already completed the draft of the purchase agreement, he or she is able to charge the cost to the party who asked him to prepare the draft in the first case. In most cases, this means the potential buyer of the property. If the seller asks the notary to prepare the draft contract and the buyer suddenly backs out, the seller is left to bear all the cost. The appointment for the notarization of a house sale usually follows a regulated procedure. The structure is as follows. Prior to the notarization of the purchase agreement, both parties, that is the buyer and the seller, are greeted by the notary and are shown in the meeting room. A reading copy of the purchase agreement is already available for each party, which corresponds to the most current draft available. The notary will check the identification documents of the buyer and the seller. And if one or both parties to the contract have questions about the draft purchase agreement or want to discuss any changes, this will also be done before and sometimes even during the notarization process itself. However, if some serious issues arise which cannot be resolved, the meeting will be postponed. Examples of such a problem or disagreement could be a renegotiation of the amount of the purchase price, which happened to me once already. During the notarization of the purchase contract, once all questions are answered, the notary will read the entire purchase agreement aloud. This is absolutely necessary and mandatory. Sometimes the notary might even stop for a few seconds, explain something in layman terms, put in a joke or two so that you don't fall asleep, and then move on. In any case, it's going to be read very fast, as the notary knows the contract almost inside out. The notary will also check if the one selling the property is the current owner. This is done by checking the current land register. He's going to do that during the meeting or just prior to entering the room. If changes are to be made to the contract, the notary makes handwritten and legible notes in the margin of the document. Most of the time stamps it as well. These handwritten changes are not removed, but remain in the original document, which the notary keeps on file. Therefore, if there's any dispute between the contracting parties, even years later, these changes to the original documents can be viewed again at the notary at any point in time. Both buyer and seller will of course receive the notarized copy of the contract after the appointment, in which the changes have already been incorporated into the text. If you're financing the property as a buyer, the seller will move out of the room and you will have a back-to-back meeting with the notary. He or she will then read out the land charge which the bank provided to him or her. Following points will always be mentioned in the purchase agreement: the exact description of the property, inventory if applicable, including its value, special agreement, the purchase price, payment of the agreed price only after all risks of the seller have been eliminated, warranty clauses, date of change of possession, etc. etc. We'll be uploading a detailed video on this purchase agreement as well. The duration of the notarization meeting depends to a large extent on how many questions need to be answered or how many and which change requests need to be taken into account. Typically, this meeting does not last more than an hour. If the agreement is already read in German, but if there's a translator involved or a notary is bilingual, then it usually takes 1.5 to 2 hours. The notary fees range from 1 to 1.5% of the purchase price of the property. As a rule, it is the buyer of the property who bears the cost for the notary. There are exceptions though. We already uploaded a video on what happens after the notary, which you can find up here.